This afternoon's event was beautifully and necessarily parachuted in with very little notice, and it is a huge privilege and a painful honor that we are having the conversations we are having today. So will you join me in welcoming Dr. Naseem Paksh-Shiraz, who will be telling us about women, life, freedom, and what's happening in Iran today.
Thank you very much, Myra. Can you all hear me? Okay. Yeah? No? Okay. Can you hear me now? Thank you. Thank you very much, Myra, and thank you for parachuting us, and to all of you who have given your Saturday afternoon to come and listen to us. I'm going to talk a little bit about Iran. I'm going to stick to a script because otherwise I can talk on and on and on about just one topic, and there's plenty to cover. There are a lot of other Iranians here in the room. We are a collective of Iranian women who have come together to become the voice of the voiceless, and please feel free to speak with any of us, and I'll ask them at the end to stand up so you know who they are and you can go to them. So let me dive in. We are witnessing a critical time, not only in the history of Iran, but also that of the region and more broadly women's movement. My talk is on an evolving situation with no one really being in a position to predict its outcome. There are far too many variables that can move in one direction or another. And today I will try to provide a snapshot of events unfolding in Iran over the last 55 days. Let me briefly contextualize compulsory hijab under the Islamic Republic of Iran. For the last 43 years, the Islamic Republic of Iran has been trying to reinforce compulsory hijab through every possible means, encoding it in the law and enforcing it through pro-regime vigilantes and the morality police on the streets. In this way, they have normalized using violence to impose the hijab on women. The authorities have arrogated to themselves the agency over women's bodies. Girls as young as 6 are forced to wear the hijab when attending school, and children as young as 7 have been killed in the protests against forced hijab. There was also reports of a 2-year-old dying. Scores of women have been arrested for their individual resistance and wearing the hijab incorrectly. I have to clarify here that the concept of wearing hijab correctly is itself very vague. For example, pro-regime rallies have included women who would have been arrested for wearing the hijab incorrectly had they been outside of those demonstrations. So you can see how it's being used politically. Next slide, please. Iranian women have been resisting compulsory hijab from the very early days of the revolution. In March 1979, just 1 month after the revolution, women protested in large numbers against enforced veiling. These are images of these demonstrations in March 1979, when women came out in large numbers, over 100,000 women, to object against compulsory hijab in Tehran. Women's bodies have been used as sites of political battles in Iran. Let me take you a little further back to 1936, when women were this time forced to unveil by the order of the monarch of the time, Reza Shah Pahlavi. This was because he wanted to project a modernized image of Iran to the world. Later, the Islamic Republic that replaced the Pahlavi state enforced the veil on women. We know how the story of the 1979 protests against compulsory hijab ended, with women being forced to cover their hair and dress modestly without the definition of modesty, with the definition of modesty fluctuating and being at the mercy of the caprices of the regime. The regime's incessant attempts at stifling Iranian women have, however, failed. Next, please. For example, in 2017, individuals removed their headscarves in public spaces, hung it on a stick, and stood on a platform as a sign of silent protest. This is the image of Vida Mowahed, the first woman to do this in late 2017, in a very busy street in downtown Tehran. The street is called Revolution Street. Vida's action inspired dozens of other women to do the same, and they were referred to as the Girls of Revolution Street. Unsurprisingly, these acts of civil disobedience were brutally punished. Next slide, please. Here is the image of Maryam Shariat Madari, who was standing on an electric box and pushed off by the morality police, resulting in multiple injuries. She was sentenced to 1 year imprisonment in Tehran's penal court, charged with encouraging corruption through the removal of hijab. You make what you may out of that. She managed to escape Iran when on bail. These are just a couple of examples of the many individuals who resisted against enforced hijab. And now I want to bring you back to 13 September 2022. Next slide, please. By now, I think many of us are familiar with the name of Mahsa Jina Amini, the 22-year-old Kurdish woman who was visiting Tehran during her holidays. On 13 September 2022, Mahsa was accompanied with her younger brother when the morality police arrested her for not wearing the hijab properly. Unlike the Girls of Revolution Street, she was not protesting anything, nor was she unveiled. The morality police found issue with her veiling. They found it unsatisfactory. Her brother pleaded with the forces, entreating them not to take her, as they were strangers in the city and did not know anyone, but this fell on deaf ears. Within a couple of hours, she went into a coma and died 3 days later, which sparked the current protests and events that are unfolding as we speak. The authorities have denied any wrongdoing, stating that she had pre-existing health conditions, claims that have been strongly refuted by her parents and family. The events that followed the death of this innocent young woman are incredible. She has become the symbol of the current protests that have swept Iran like wildfire. Next, please. The slogan, "Woman, Life, Freedom," was used during Mahsa's funeral ceremonies in her hometown of Sanandaj, a Kurdish city in northwestern Iran. Men and women chanted the slogan to express their anger at the killing of an innocent woman. The Kurdish version of the slogan, coined in the late 20th century by the Kurdish freedom movement, has since been adapted by different groups, most recently by the Iranian protesters. The Persian translation, which reads Zan Zendegi Azadi, which you see here transcribed in the colors of the Iranian flag, can be heard across Iran. The slogan has also highlighted the Islamic Republic's ideology, which has been used to systematically exploit and oppress women and the freedom of all its citizens. Next, please. Women poured out in different parts of the country to protest this killing. This time, many took off their hijabs in defiance of the strict veiling codes. And I want to narrate this through the images that came out of Iran following Mahsa's murder. I want to take a few minutes here to talk about Iranian women. Iranian women are highly educated, with over 60% of the university student population being female. One of the outcomes of the Islamic Republic was that by Islamicizing the public spaces, it inadvertently facilitated greater participation of those women who came from traditional backgrounds, families who would have not allowed their daughters to participate in what they considered the corrupt, westernized university spaces before the revolution no longer found education or female employment incompatible with their belief systems after the revolution. This has resulted in a highly educated female population in Iran, many of whom no longer think or act in the same way as their parents. Many of these educated women are now the mothers of millennials and Gen Zs. These millennials and Gen Zs are very well connected to the world outside, despite the strict restrictions over the internet within Iran. In these two images, you can see how the women have unveiled and are bravely facing the morality, police, and authorities. Next slide, please. It's important to state that Iranians are not protesting against Islam or any other religion. They are fighting for their basic rights. The Orwellian regime has arrogated to itself the agency over women's bodies and lives. Women cannot choose whether they want to wear a hijab or not. They have lost their autonomy, not only over their bodies, but also their lives. They cannot obtain a passport or travel outside the country without their husband's legal permission. They do not have the right to custody or divorce. They are not allowed to sing or dance in public. They do not have equal access to employment, with positions such as the judiciary being unavailable to women. If a woman is the victim of crime, legally, her life is worth half that of a man. However, the demands are no longer limited to gender discrimination. Protesters are demanding freedom of speech, not only for journalists and intellectuals, but all citizens. Many of the chants explicitly state that they are fighting to take back Iran from the clutches of a regime with which they do not relate. Next, please. Many of the published official data will show a highly religious country, which does not necessarily correspond to the society for those who are familiar with it. Two scholars in Netherlands undertook a survey of 200,000 people, as they believed the skewing factor in the existing survey results to be the effect of fear. Iranians were terrified of the regime to respond truthfully to strangers who would knock on their door or telephone them. And this is just an amazing piece of research that has been undertaken, and it's quite rigorous. And you can see very clearly that it was undertaken in June 2022, just before the current uprisings, and almost 80% of the population is against compulsory hijab. If you're interested, I would encourage you to go to their website, and you can see the results of their research. Next, please. Young men and some of the older generations joined the women in these protests. Thus far, there have been reports of over 300 people being killed, including many children. Several hundreds more have been arrested, with many of their families having no contact or information about the whereabouts of their loved ones. A warning that I will be talking briefly about further deaths in the next slides, but I will not discuss any of the gruesome details here. Next slide, please. Here is the image of a 16-year-old called Nikasha Karami, who was killed for burning her veil during the protests. Her body was returned 8 days after she disappeared. The authorities claimed that she died for falling off from a building that was under construction. Next slide, please. Sarina Ismailzadeh was another 16-year-old who was killed for protesting against compulsory hijab. This time, the authorities claimed that she had a history of mental illness and committed suicide by jumping off a 5-story building. There have been numerous reports of children being killed for protesting against the regime. Next, please. These killings, however, have only added further fuel to the uprising, spreading into different cities, with women showing incredible courage in the face of the brutal crackdown by the regime. Next, please. The sudden and massive turn of events coincided with the beginning of the academic year. On Monday, 3rd October, during one of students' protests, the main campus of the Sharif University of Technology in Tehran was stormed by the Basij paramilitary troops and the Guardians of the Islamic Revolution, leading to the arrests of many students and a significant amount of casualties and fatalities. Students who were protesting peacefully inside the campus were not allowed to leave the premises, and entry to the building was blocked. Large numbers of people walked towards the campus as surrounding roads were blocked, demanding their release. This is a picture of the people outside the campus of Sharif University. The harassment of students in well-known universities continues. The regime has taken over the security units in order to spy on, interrogate, torture, and imprison students they think might protest. The security forces can block the exit doors, detaining students and interrogating them for hours to extract information about their protest plans. In many universities across Iran, students have been held captive in a small room on campus for several hours. They are beaten, tortured severely by electric shockers and batons. When they were finally released after being forced to sign a letter promising not to take part in any protests, then, and they were subsequently arrested again. These are all happening in an environment in which internet access is severely restricted. Iranian students now live under a shadow of terror on a daily basis, and they do not have a voice to express the trauma they're going through. Next, please. Women's acts of civil disobedience are about bodily autonomy. They have the support of many women in Iran who choose to wear the hijab, but do not see its imposition on others as Islamic. Over the last couple of decades, there have been a few Muslim clerics in Iran who have argued not only against compulsory hijab, but also it not being obligatory for practicing Muslim women. However, this has only resulted in the marginalization of such debates and the severe punishment of those who propose them. As you can see in this image, students with different clothing choices are sitting together in a show of solidarity. These are images that do not get much coverage in Western media. However, a few Muslim individuals outside Iran call Iranian women's opposition to compulsory hijab as either going against the principles of Islam or Islamophobic, both of which are false arguments. These assertions might stem from ignorance, malice, or simply the desire to hijack a topical event to gain attention. Any such claim, at the very least, undermines the struggles of Iranian women who have to live under a regime that systematically oppresses and exploits women. Next image, please. I just thought, I would like to show you further images of the solidarity between women who differ in their choices of veiling. Next, please. Images of women defying the authorities who impose and enforce these impositions on them are posted on social media daily. The picture on the right shows an unveiled woman following the repressive military force. The other three images show women next to, in front of, behind a mullah without their veil. Next, please. These acts of defiance have now spread to schools. Numerous secondary school girls removed their veils and posted it on social media. There are videos of a girls' secondary school in Shiraz which had invited a member of the feared paramilitary Basij to give a talk to the students, but found himself surrounded by a large group of girls who heckled him, chanting, "Basij, get lost," and "Death to Khamenei." Next, please. Other videos show schoolgirls removing their veils, tearing down the pictures of Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, as well as Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, and stamping their foot on them. There are also videos of girls marching outside their schools, swinging their hijab in the air, and chanting anti-regime slogans. In yet another one, they throw out a male authority who has visited their school to quieten the protests. Next, please. Interestingly, these acts of protests have spread to even primary school children, as you can see in the images here. Next, please. The regime has tried to tighten its grasp on schoolgirls. They have orchestrated pro-regime rallies and are forcing students to attend them. In one of the latest tragedies, schoolgirls at a secondary school in Ardabil, a city in northwest of Iran, refused to attend these demonstrations and perform the state's ideological song that praises the supreme leader. Plainclothes security forces were summoned to the school and started beating students who refused to participate. Asra Panahi, a 16-year-old, sustained severe injuries, including internal bleeding, and died at the hospital 2 days later on 15th October. This time, the regime cited a congenital heart condition as the cause of Asra's death. When this was clearly refuted, as she had won a regional swimming competition, they announced suicide by taking pills as cause of death. Reasons provided for the death of children killed by the regime over the last few weeks have even included being bitten by a dog. Next slide, please. Despite the repressive measures, however, Iranian women's defiance continues and manifests itself in different ways. Elnaz Rekabi, the Iranian sport climber representing Iran in Asian climbing competitions final in Seoul, appeared without her hijab on Sunday, 16th October. A couple of athletes have previously dared to disobey the strict rules for female athletes, but then never returned to Iran, seeking asylum elsewhere. Elnaz, however, returned to Iran. Next slide, please. Since then, Iranian athletes have shown their defiance in different ways. On 10th November, archer Parmida Qasemi removed her hijab during the closing ceremony of archery competitions in Tehran itself, in the presence of officials while being cheered by fans. They've all had to come and have some sort of a forced confession saying that the wind blew their scarf away or there was a malfunction with the hijab, but these were acts of solidarity. Next slide, please. My focus today has been on the women who are at the forefront of these battles. I haven't even referred to the workers of Iran's oil and petrochemical industry who had gone on strike as part of the anti-regime demonstrations. This is obviously a very effective step that puts further pressure on the regime. I also want to acknowledge the brutal killing of over 90 people in Zahedan, a border city in southeastern Iran, on 30th September. Many believe the number of dead is far more than what is reported, with hundreds more injured. The state has blamed the Salafist jihadi militia Jaish al-Adl, who have denied any involvement. The image of the man tied to the flagpole is Khoda Noor Lejei, who was shot during this massacre. The regime's security forces prevented him from receiving medical care and led him to bleed out to die. Next, please. Let me end by referring to the huge amount of art that has been pouring out of Iran since the uprising just over 2 months ago. Already, 30 songs have been released in different genres, all to a very high standard. Most of these are produced as underground music within Iran. There have also been the usual painting, caricatures, and video and comedy skits produced by both professionals and amateurs. The image above is an anonymous art installation. Tehran residents woke up one morning to find that the water of several public ponds and fountains had been painted red to resemble the bloodshed in the country and regime brutality. There have since been numerous installations across the country. Since Mahsa Jina Amini's murder, Iranians have not only braved the streets and faced live ammunition used by the police, they have also taken social media by storm, with Mahsa Amini's hashtag in Persian alone exceeding 400 million instances on Twitter to date. The tweets, which started with Iranians expressing their rage against her killing, quickly expanded to listing a litany of social ills they are facing, as well as the alternative society they desire to have instead of the current one. Next, please. Shervin Hajipur, a young artist, turned some of these tweets into a song which he released on 27 September. Within 48 hours, this video had gained 40 million views on his Instagram page. This despite the shutdown of mobile internet by the authorities within a few days of the recent uprisings. Shervin was arrested on 29 September, so within 2 days, and his song deleted from his Instagram page on the same day. This was, however, futile, as his song has now turned into the anthem for the protests. There have been English and German performances of the song, and a Dutch dance company has performed the song. There have been many other artists who have been covering the song. He was later released on bail and subsequently sentenced to spreading anti-government propaganda. Shervin has dominated the nominations for the new category of the Grammy Awards, which honors a song dedicated to social change. There have been around 113,000 nominations, of which 83% is for Shervin's song, Baraye. It's a song that I played before we started, and if there's time, we can perhaps play it at the end. Next, please. The Iranian hip-hop rapper Toomaj Salehi became popular for his protest raps, encouraged Iranians to participate in the protests, and attended the protests himself and posted videos about it. He was kidnapped brutally on 30th September, and his family are very concerned about his life, and there's been no contact with him. Next, please. 27-year-old Saman Yasin is another rapper who was violently arrested for participating in the protests. He has been charged with enmity against God for speaking against the regime and was sentenced to death on 29th October. On 6th November, 227 Iranian lawmakers in the parliament urged the judiciary to deal decisively, and I'm quoting them, deal decisively with the perpetrators of these crimes and with all those who assisted in the crimes and provoked rioters, unquote. There is a real fear of a wave of executions and life sentences handed down to those arrested over the last weeks. The Iranian women and men are relentless, though, and will live in hope. Thank you.
I think there is now an opportunity for some questions, if anyone has any. There's one back here. I might not be able to get all the way to you with the mic. If you don't mind coming around.
Hi. The talk was really fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
You mentioned action in primary schools, and I saw that the kids in the photo had quite short hair. I was wondering, does that mean that boys are taking part as well?
Yes. So we're seeing videos of boys also chanting the slogan of Women, Life, Freedom, primary school and secondary school boys. Obviously, this is a protest turned by many into revolution, according to many commentators, by women. But what is very significant about this movement is that not only in the history of Iran, not only in the history of the Middle East, but in the history of humankind, if you think about it, it's the first women's-led movement where men have stood behind and beside them and have been taking the bullet for women's rights. And this is something that is not being covered. It's not being given enough attention to in the West. We have pro-regime reporters who are covering this. So even in Western media, they speak with people who are a mouthpiece for the government. It's not being covered. Yes, there are a lot of young men who are standing for women's rights. And I would dare anybody to give me one example ever in the history of humankind that it's happened before. This is a renaissance.
There's one here.
Thank you, Naseem, so much for coming and speaking and for sharing your understanding, but also for really clearly explaining what's happening.
Thank you.
And it feels like in the constant news cycles, it's hard for people to actually cut through and get that insight. And so my question for you is, what are the sorts of practical acts of solidarity that people attending here, people who live in Scotland, people who have freedom of speech, what can we do, or what are people asking us to do to keep raising awareness of these issues and the courage of these women?
So we have quite a number of very practical things, and I know that my colleagues now in protest are here and can give you more information. The first thing is please pick up one of these flyers, and at the back we do have further information and also a QR code that will let you know how you can help us. We want everybody to. Oh, this is stuck. Sorry, I'm pulling it. So you can see at the back of this. Can you please all write to your MPs and ask them to put pressure on the UK government not to negotiate with this brutal Islamic Republic government. I understand that it's very difficult for all of us here in Britain. I understand that oil and gas prices have gone up, but no amount of warmth from our radiators is worth the blood that is being shed within Iran. The negotiations are happening because of oil and gas in Iran. Oil and gas has in many ways been a curse on the Iranian people. And we urge Western governments not to negotiate with the Islamic Republic. And they are not representing the Iranian people. They are a brutal regime. They are killing their own people. This is unacceptable. So if you can all please write to our MPs and ask them not to do that. We do have a template, and if at this point I can ask those who are, we are a collective, we all play different roles. I have the honor of speaking today, but a lot of work happens behind the scene by a lot of wonderful women who don't get any recognition, but they would be great resources to go to. And if you can all please stand up and just wave your hands so people know who they can go to. So if you have any questions afterwards, you can come to any of us. Thank you.
Is there another question in the room? Well, you think there's one online, which is from Sean. Can you tell us more about the oil industry protests happening in Iran and whether that solidarity is happening with activists here?
It's very difficult for us to have a direct contact, between people who are outside and people who are inside. The regime always used to dismiss anything that would happen within Iran as a Western conspiracy. All of us who here would be dismissed as not really Iranian, we're westernized, we don't know better. We can all be very easily be brushed away as agents of whoever you choose, CIA, MI5, MI6, Mossad, whichever, and therefore dismissed. In many ways, what is quite unique in a list of other things that are unique about this protest is that it has unified people, that people outside and inside are unified in wanting to bring an end to this regime. Having said that, because of the sanctions, which we now fully support, because whenever you lift the sanctions, the money goes actually straight into the government, and they use that to actually crack down on the people. But it would be very difficult for us to say, if the question is about financial support of those people, we wouldn't be able to send money into Iran. We would have liked to support people inside, but we're not doing that. I think we each are playing our role. Our role here outside is bringing awareness about what's happening in Iran, being the voice of the voiceless who cannot get their voices outside. People like the oil workers inside Iran are going on strike, and they're playing their part by putting pressure there. It hasn't been continuous, so there have been days of those strikes, but obviously it's very difficult for people to continue those strikes. So we are each playing our own role in the way that we can. For the first time, Iranians outside united. There were over 100,000 people who marched in Berlin just a few weeks ago, and that was great because it did put pressure on the German government. Similarly, over 50,000 in Toronto, and then Trudeau finally came around, that's the Prime Minister of Canada, to denounce the Islamic Republic and put over 10,000 of their people under sanctions.
Is there another question in the room? Are people being shy? There's a second one there, and I think there's one last one online.
I have a lot of interest in children's literature, and I was wondering if there are any picture books or books that are being distributed, or zines even, in Iran, because I realize it must be very difficult to get rebellious materials around. But are there any titles, either inside or outside of Iran, that you'd like to recommend on these topics for talking to young people about them?
I think, for teenagers and above, one book that I always find very effective in introducing Iran and what's happening to it, albeit up to a particular point, because it was published, I think, in 2001 or 2, is Persepolis. It's a graphic novel by Marjan Satrapi. I also know that Surur is working on having a book display on Iran, and she's also collecting titles for children, both children's age. So if you speak with Surur, she'll be much better placed. I know more of the older age group, but she's been very good in kind of collating a list for both younger children, teenagers, and adults. Yeah.
So there's one last question online, which was from Karim, which says, when will we know if the protests are working? What might be signs of cracks that show the end?
That's the million-dollar question. I think there are, we need more people within Iran to find the courage to come out. It's obviously very difficult. both what's going to happen in Iran as well as the Western powers not recognizing the Islamic Republic as a valid government. Those would be the signs, I think, but it can go either way. It could either get to the place where, people are victorious, which is what we hope, and if it doesn't, the fear is that it's going to be even worse than what it was before.
I think we will leave it there. We're lucky enough to have members of the collective here, so you can, if you're too shy to ask a question to the microphone, do feel free to ask them your questions and ask them how you can get involved and show solidarity and help us reach that tipping point. Will you please all join me in saying a very big thank you to Dr. Naseem and to the members of the collective who have come out today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm going to play the